12 years ago, he left town believing the girl he loved had chosen another man. Heartbroken, he disappeared into the Wild West, never expecting to return. But when Ethan Carter finally rode back home, he found his childhood sweetheart standing on a gallows, condemned for a crime she never committed. With only moments left before the rope tightened, he faced a choice that would change both their lives forever. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe true love can survive even the cruelest misunderstandings, be sure to subscribe and join us for this unforgettable cowboy love story. Dusty autumn winds swept across the streets of Dust Hollow, carrying dry leaves between weathered storefronts, while gray clouds drifted low above the distant mesas. Ethan Carter rode into town shortly before sunset, his bay horse moving at a slow, tired pace after weeks on the trail. At 32, Ethan was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark brown hair touched by dust and years of hard travel. A short beard framed his strong jaw, and faint lines around his blue eyes hinted at a life spent facing disappointment without complaint. Most people remembered him as a kind-hearted ranch boy with a quick smile. Few knew how deeply 12 years of loneliness had changed him. The town looked smaller than he remembered, or perhaps he had simply carried too many memories for too long. 12 years earlier, Ethan had left Dust Hollow, believing his childhood sweetheart had chosen another man. He could still remember standing outside the church social and seeing Sarah Bennett laughing beside Jacob Turner, the wealthy son of the largest cattle owner in the county. Young, foolish, and heartbroken, Ethan never stayed long enough to hear the truth. Since then, he had drifted across the frontier, working cattle drives, repairing fences, sleeping beneath open skies, and convincing himself he had forgotten her. He never had. As Ethan dismounted outside the general store, an elderly shopkeeper named Walter Briggs, a thin gray-haired man known for knowing every rumor in town, stepped onto the porch. "You picked a bad week to come home," Walter said quietly. Something in the old man's voice made Ethan's stomach tighten. "What happened?" Walter hesitated. "They're hanging Sarah Bennett 3 days from now." The words struck harder than any fist. Ethan stood frozen. Sarah Bennett was 29 now, a skilled survey clerk who spent her days documenting land records for the town. She was tall and graceful, with long auburn hair, warm green eyes, and fair skin lightly touched by the western sun. Everyone knew her as honest, hard-working, and gentle. After losing both parents as a teenager, she had become even more determined to help others, often giving away money she could barely afford to spare. "That's impossible," Ethan whispered. Walter lowered his eyes. "They say she stole confidential land maps and sold them to outside speculators. The entire town believed it. But Ethan didn't, because Sarah would never betray the people of Dust Hollow. Not for money. Not for anything." An hour later, Ethan stood outside the jailhouse window. Sarah sat alone inside the cell, her hands folded quietly in her lap. Then he saw it, a small wooden pendant hanging from her neck, the same pendant he had carved for her when they were children. For 12 years, she had never taken it off, and in that single moment Ethan realized the greatest mistake of his life had never been leaving Dust Hollow. It had been leaving Sarah behind. The next morning, Ethan Carter woke before sunrise in the small room above the livery stable. Sleep had barely touched him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah sitting alone behind iron bars with a rope waiting for her 3 days away. The thought settled heavily in his chest. 12 years ago, he had left because of heartbreak. This time, he refused to leave her behind. The first place he visited was the Land Survey Office, where Sarah had worked for nearly 8 years. The building sat near the edge of town, its windows coated with desert dust and its shelves packed with decades of maps and property records. Sarah had built a reputation there for precision and honesty. She was known for checking every measurement twice and refusing favors from wealthy landowners. Some admired her integrity. Others found it inconvenient. Inside the office, Ethan met Deputy Clerk Nathan Holloway, a nervous man in his early 40s with thinning blonde hair and round spectacles constantly sliding down his nose. Nathan had worked beside Sarah for years and clearly feared becoming involved. Even so, guilt weighed heavily on him. After several minutes of hesitation, Nathan quietly revealed something important. 3 weeks earlier, Sarah had discovered discrepancies between old boundary maps and newer county records. Entire sections of ranch land belonging to struggling families had been reassigned to investors connected to powerful men in town. Sarah had spent days comparing documents before concluding that someone had altered official records. "She said the mistakes weren't mistakes," Nathan whispered. "She said somebody was stealing land one map at a time." That statement led Ethan directly to the courthouse. Judge Walter Grayson ruled Dust Hollow with an authority that few questioned. At 61, he was tall and imposing with silver hair neatly combed back, sharp gray eyes, and a carefully trimmed beard that projected wisdom and dignity. For years he had presented himself as a champion of law and order, yet rumors followed him like shadows. Ranchers who challenged his decisions often lost land disputes. Families who opposed him somehow found themselves buried beneath legal fees. Outside the courthouse, Ethan noticed something unexpected. Jacob Turner, the man Ethan had spent 12 years resenting, stood alone beside a hitching rail. Jacob was 33 now, broad-shouldered with sandy blonde hair, weathered skin, and calm brown eyes. Unlike his wealthy father, he carried himself without arrogance. In fact, he seemed uncomfortable with attention. When Ethan approached, tension instantly filled the air. Neither man had spoken since Ethan left town. "I heard you're trying to help Sarah," Jacob said. Ethan studied him carefully. "Why would you care?" The answer came immediately. "Because she's family." Ethan frowned. Jacob looked genuinely confused. "Sarah never told you?" The truth arrived like a punch to the stomach. Jacob wasn't Sarah's former sweetheart. He was her cousin. The silence that followed felt unbearable. For 12 years Ethan had carried bitterness, built upon a misunderstanding. Jacob shook his head. "She waited for you, Ethan, longer than she should have." The words hurt far more than any accusation. That evening, Ethan finally gained permission to visit Sarah's cell. She looked exhausted, but remained remarkably composed. Her auburn hair had been tied back loosely, and dark circles rested beneath eyes that still carried quiet determination. When Ethan told her what Jacob had revealed, Sarah lowered her gaze. "I wrote letters after you left," she said softly. "Dozens." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "I never received any. They were returned unopened." Neither of them needed to ask who might have intercepted them. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Sarah reached beneath the cot and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a rough sketch of an old mining region west of town. "I found this hidden inside one of the original survey books," she said, "the day before the maps disappeared." Ethan unfolded it carefully. At the edge of the drawing, barely visible beneath faded ink, someone had written a location: Silver Creek Mine. Sarah met his eyes. "I think that's where the real records are." For the first time since returning home, Ethan felt something stronger than fear. A lead, and somewhere beyond the desert hills, buried beneath years of lies, the truth was waiting. The morning of the execution arrived beneath a pale gray sky. Dust Hollow had never felt so quiet. Townspeople filled the square long before sunrise, gathering around the wooden gallows that stood like a monument to fear. Some came seeking justice. Others came simply because they could not look away. Sarah Bennett stood on the platform with her hands bound in front of her. At 29, she remained remarkably composed despite the noose hanging only inches away. Her long auburn hair stirred in the morning wind, and although exhaustion showed beneath her green eyes, her dignity remained untouched. She had spent 3 days preparing herself for death, not because she accepted her guilt, but because she feared the truth would die with her. Across the square, Judge Walter Grayson watched from the front row. His silver beard was neatly trimmed as always, and his black suit carried the authority he had cultivated for decades. Yet beneath his calm expression lived growing anxiety. Ethan had disappeared 2 days earlier after visiting Sarah's cell. No one knew where he had gone. Only Sarah suspected. Only Sarah hoped. Miles away, Ethan Carter urged his horse through a narrow canyon west of town. His face was streaked with dirt and exhaustion. He had spent 2 days searching the abandoned Silver Creek mine. Inside its collapsing tunnels, he had discovered far more than hidden maps. The chest Sarah had predicted was there. Inside were original land surveys, forged property transfers, financial ledgers documenting bribes, and letters connecting Walter Grayson to years of land theft. Entire families had been robbed through carefully altered records. Native burial grounds had been illegally seized. The evidence was overwhelming. Most shocking of all, Ethan had found a witness, Emma Grayson, Walter's wife. Emma was 56, slender and soft-spoken, with silver blonde hair pinned neatly beneath a simple bonnet. Years of living beside a powerful husband had taught her silence, yet years of guilt had finally become unbearable. She admitted she had witnessed Walter hiding documents inside the mine months earlier. Now she rode beside Ethan. Back in town, Sheriff Daniel Mercer climbed the Gallows steps. At 48, was a broad-chested former cavalry officer with a thick mustache and stern features. Though respected for maintaining order, he had spent years trusting Walter Grayson without question. Today he looked uncertain. Sarah noticed it immediately. Perhaps he was beginning to doubt. The executioner stepped forward and tightened the rope around Sarah's neck. The crowd fell silent. Walter Grayson slowly removed his pocket watch. A smile almost appeared. Then came the sound. Horse hooves. Fast, desperate, growing louder. Heads turned toward the western road. A rider burst through the dust. Ethan. The horse barely stopped before Ethan jumped from the saddle, carrying a weathered wooden chest. Emma Grayson followed close behind. Walter's face instantly lost color. "Stop this execution," Ethan shouted. Sheriff Mercer stepped forward. "You'd better have proof." Ethan slammed the chest onto the platform. Documents spilled across the wooden boards, original surveys, forged signatures, payment records, letters, map after map after map. The square erupted into shocked murmurs. Walter Grayson's hands began to tremble. Ethan pointed directly at him. "Sarah uncovered your fraud. You framed her before she could expose you." Walter opened his mouth to deny it, but Emma stepped forward. For the first time in years, she looked directly at her husband. "I saw you hide those records." Silence. The entire town stared. Tears filled Emma's eyes. "You stole from families. You stole from this town. And you tried to murder an innocent woman." The words shattered whatever authority Walter still possessed. Sheriff Mercer carefully reviewed several documents. His expression darkened with every page. Finally, he looked toward the crowd, then toward Sarah, then toward Walter. "The execution is canceled." Relief swept through the square. Sarah closed her eyes as tears finally escaped. Mercer continued. "Sarah Bennett is cleared of all charges pending federal review." A cheer rose from parts of the crowd. Others stood stunned. Walter Grayson attempted to step backward. Mercer grabbed his arm. "You are under arrest." For the first time in decades, Walter Grayson looked small, defeated, broken. As deputies escorted him away, Ethan climbed onto the platform. For a brief moment, neither he nor Sarah spoke. They simply looked at one another. Alive. The rope that had nearly ended everything hung uselessly beside them, and for the first time in 12 years, neither of them had to say goodbye. The weeks following Walter Grayson's arrest brought changes that Dust Hollow had not seen in decades. Survey crews reopened old records. Property boundaries were corrected. Families who had spent years fighting impossible legal battles suddenly found themselves receiving land that had always belonged to them. The town was healing, but for Ethan Carter and Sarah Bennett, the deepest wounds had never been written on paper. They had been written across 12 lost years. Most mornings, Ethan could be found helping repair an old cabin beside Willow Creek, a narrow stream that wound through cottonwood trees just outside town. The cabin had once belonged to Sarah's parents. After their deaths, it had slowly fallen into disrepair, while Sarah focused on surviving rather than rebuilding. Now they worked on it together. Sarah often arrived carrying bundles of supplies, while Ethan repaired broken boards or replaced sections of the porch. She was still the same woman he remembered in many ways. Her kindness came naturally, and she somehow managed to remain patient even after everything she had endured. Yet Ethan noticed new things too. There was strength in her now. The kind earned through loneliness rather than comfort. One afternoon, while repainting a window frame, Sarah laughed as Ethan accidentally spilled white paint across his boots. The sound stopped him completely. For years he had remembered her face, but he had forgotten her laugh. That realization hurt more than he expected. Nearby, an old golden retriever named Duke slept beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree. The dog was nearly 11 years old, his golden coat faded with age, and his muzzle almost completely white. Duke had belonged to Sarah's father before his death, and had remained by Sarah's side ever since. His slow movements reflected his age, but his loyalty remained unchanged. "You know," Sarah said, while scratching behind Duke's ears, "he waited for you too." Ethan smiled. "Duke probably forgot me years ago." The old dog lifted his head and slowly walked over before resting it against Ethan's leg. Sarah laughed again. Apparently not. As summer approached, they spent more evenings talking beside the creek after work was finished. For the first time, Sarah spoke openly about the years after Ethan left. She admitted how often she had visited the train station, hoping he might return. She confessed that every birthday she still carried the small wooden pendant he had carved as a teenager. Most painful of all, she revealed that she had never accepted any marriage proposals despite receiving several. "I kept thinking maybe you'd come back," she said quietly. Ethan struggled to answer. Guilt settled heavily inside him. He told her about the cattle drives across Texas, the winters spent sleeping beneath wagons, the months working ranches in Colorado and New Mexico. He spoke of beautiful places and dangerous ones, but every story ended the same way: alone. One evening, Sheriff Daniel Mercer visited the cabin with good news. Walter Grayson had officially been transferred to federal authorities. Additional investigations were uncovering even more evidence of corruption. The town was finally free. After Mercer left, silence settled across the creek. The stars appeared one by one above the valley. Sarah sat at the end of the dock, her auburn hair glowing softly beneath moonlight. Ethan joined her. Neither spoke immediately. The sound of moving water filled the darkness. Finally, Ethan took a slow breath. "There wasn't a single year I stopped thinking about you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. He continued before fear could stop him. "I left because I thought you loved somebody else. I spent 12 years trying to forget you." He lowered his gaze. "I failed." The words hung in the night air. Sarah wiped at her eyes but couldn't stop the tears. Neither could Ethan. "I loved you then," he said quietly. "I love you now." For a moment the world seemed to stop. Then Sarah smiled through tears she had carried for more than a decade. "I've been waiting 12 years to hear that." The distance between them finally disappeared. Not because time had healed it, but because truth had, and beneath a sky full of stars, two hearts that had spent 12 years lost finally found their way home. 1 year later, Dust Hollow no longer resembled the frightened town Ethan Carter had ridden into on that dusty autumn evening. The gallows that once stood in the center of the square had been dismantled piece by piece. In its place stood a small public park where children now played beneath the shade of a young oak tree planted to symbolize justice, truth, and new beginnings. The transformation extended far beyond the square. Families whose land had been stolen finally held legal deeds once again. Ranch fences had been rebuilt. Abandoned homesteads showed signs of life. Businesses that had struggled under years of corruption slowly recovered. And at the heart of those changes stood Sarah Bennett. At 30 years old, Sarah had become the newly appointed director of the Dust Hollow Land Records Office. Her reputation for honesty had spread throughout the county. Ranchers traveled miles seeking her help with boundary disputes because they trusted her judgment. Though her long auburn hair was often tied back while she worked, and her hands remained stained with ink from countless maps, she carried herself with quiet confidence that came from surviving hardship and refusing to surrender to it. Meanwhile, Ethan Carter had finally done something many people never expected. He stopped leaving. The wandering cowboy, who had spent 12 years drifting across the frontier, had returned permanently to his family's neglected ranch north of town. Under his care, the property flourished again. New cattle filled the pastures. Broken barns had been repaired. The ranch house once again glowed with lantern light each evening. For Ethan, however, the greatest reward had nothing to do with cattle or land. It was waking each morning, knowing Sarah was still there. As spring turned into summer, preparations quietly began for a wedding. Nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress outsiders, exactly what both of them wanted. The ceremony took place beside Willow Creek, near the cabin they had restored together. Nearly the entire town attended. Sheriff Daniel Mercer stood among the guests, looking far more relaxed than he had during the dark days of Walter Grayson's rule. Jacob Turner helped organize seating and decorations, proving once again that he had never held resentment over Ethan's long misunderstanding. Even Emma Grayson attended. The past year had aged her noticeably. Her silver blonde hair had grown thinner, and sadness still lingered behind her eyes. Yet many townspeople respected her courage for choosing truth over loyalty to her husband. Though she remained quiet throughout most public gatherings, she was gradually rebuilding a place within the community. Duke, Sarah's aging golden retriever, wandered freely among the guests, accepting scraps of food and attention from children. At 12 years old, his muzzle had turned completely white, and his steps had slowed considerably, but he seemed determined to witness every moment. As sunset painted the sky gold and crimson, Ethan and Sarah exchanged simple vows beneath the cottonwood trees. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic promises, only honesty, the kind both had spent years searching for. When the ceremony ended, applause echoed across the creek. Sarah slipped her hand into Ethan's. For a brief moment, neither spoke. They simply watched the people around them, laughing, talking, and celebrating. A town that had once gathered to witness an execution now gathered to celebrate a future. Later that evening, after most guests had returned home, Ethan and Sarah climbed a small hill overlooking Dust Hollow. The new oak tree stood visible in the center of town. Lanterns glowed warmly along the streets. The courthouse remained open, but no longer inspired fear. Everything looked different. Not because the buildings had changed, because the people had. Sarah rested her head lightly against Ethan's shoulder. For years she had believed Dust Hollow would always be defined by betrayal. For years Ethan had believed he could never truly come home again. Both had been wrong. As the final light disappeared behind the distant red mountains, Ethan tightened his hand around hers. They understood something clearly now. Justice had saved Sarah's life. Truth had exposed the lies, but neither of those things had brought them all the way home. The thing that finally guided them back was a love that had survived 12 years of silence, distance, and misunderstanding. And as Dust Hollow settled peacefully beneath the stars, Ethan and Sarah stood together, watching the town heal, knowing they would never lose each other again. Sometimes the deepest losses in life are not caused by distance, but by words never spoken and truths never discovered in time. Ethan and Sarah's story reminds us that people can carry love, hope, and loyalty much longer than we imagine. In our own lives, there may be someone we miss, someone we misunderstood, or someone who is still waiting for a conversation that never happened. Perhaps the greatest gift we can give each other is not perfection, but the courage to seek the truth before giving up on the people who matter. If this story touched your heart, please share where you're watching from and tell us in the comments. Have you ever reconnected with someone important after years apart? We'd love to hear your story. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about love, hope, second chances, and the American West, please like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next journey. May God bless you, your family, and your home with peace, good health, strength, and hope wherever you are. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we'll see you in the next story.